The American Revolution was a time in history that represents freedom and how Americans fought for it. Yet how did the revolution come to be?
What did the English government impose upon the colonists that would make them go as far as breaking off from their mother country and risk it all on the hope of freedom?
The American Revolution shows how people felt that they didn't have rights. The revolution was not just about taxes and tea.
The colonists realized that they had certain rights derived from natural law, such as freedom, liberty, and a right to representation.
This podcast, we will talk about the Stamp Act, Tea Act, Sugar Act, Coloring Act, and Currency Act. We will examine the question, why do people rebel? To start us off, Sunny will help explain to us the Currency Act.
The Currency Act was a British law passed by the Parliament of Great Britain on September 1st, 1764, that was designed to control the colonial currency system. The Currency Act is any of several acts of the Parliament of Great Britain that regulated paper money issued by the colonies of British America. The act sought to protect British merchants and creditors from being paid in depreciated colonial currency. The colonies suffered a constant shortage of currency. There were no gold or silver mines, and currency could not only be obtained through trade as regulated by Great Britain. Many of the colonies felt no alternative to printing their own money, paper money, in the form of bills of credit. But because there was no common regulation and in fact no standard value on which to base the notes, confusion ensued. Notes were issued by land banks or loan offices, which based the value of mortgaged lands. Some notes paid interest, others did not. Some could be used only for purchase and not to repay debt. There was no standard value common to all colonies. British merchants' creditors were not very uncomfortable with the system of the obvious complexity. On September 1st, 1764, Parliament passed the Currency Act, effectively assuming control over the colonial currency system. The act prohibited the issue of any new bills and reissue of existing currency.
The Sugar Act of 1764 was one of the series of taxes that divided Great Britain and its colonies in America. It was imposed by the British government on the colonists. Its purpose was to reduce the rate of tax on molasses and also make sure the British collected the tax. Before this act, smugglers would smuggle in molasses and avoid paying any tax. This also established that British courts would decide the outcomes of trials for tax violators. The Sugar Act stopped trade between colonies and the French, Dutch, and Spanish in the West Indies. The colonists were taxed more for goods including sugar, certain wines, coffee, pimento, cambric, and printed calico. Timber and iron were included in the products that could only be traded with England. The effect of the Sugar Act had an economic impact as well as raising the issue of the British courts taking power away from the colonial courts. Both of these reasons were a cause for rebellion. The Sugar Act and Currency Act set the stage for the Stamp Act.
The English government imposed heavy taxes upon the colonists. One of the most ruthless of those taxes was the Stamp Act. Issued in 1765, it said that all printed material had to carry a stamp, which was, unsurprisingly, not free. The Stamp Act was especially despised by newspaper printers and lawyers, people who used a large amount of paper. The tax was actually passed purely to gain revenue for England. A large amount of people who did not like or appreciate the idea of paying for every piece of paper they used. So in October, people who wanted the Stamp Act gone organized the Stamp Act Congress, which, after a meeting, decided to boycott English goods, the first major coordinated action between all of the colonies. This was good for the local artists of the colonies, but bad for the merchants that relied upon selling goods from England. There were also several street actions that occasionally became violent, and were coordinated groups who called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Soon, on March 20th of 1766, the English colonists' efforts were rewarded and the Stamp Act was repealed.
The Quartering Act of 1765 was perhaps one of the more degrading of the intolerable acts for colonists. It forced them to keep British soldiers in their homes against their will and provide for them supplies and food. It was passed on March 24th of 1765 and never truly ended, as the colonists simply refused to be hosted soldiers. However, the rebellion did have consequences, such as when New York refused to host the soldiers and the British shut down their government. Some of the impacts of the Quartering Act were that later the colonists would harbor negative thoughts about the British intentions, and that would affect how they thought about the British for years. The Quartering Act is also one of the reasons the colonists wanted freedom from the British, so they would no longer have to follow their every whim.
Another one of the infuriating things that the English government did was put taxes on tea. The 1773 tax on tea actually lowered the cost of tea, but many of the colonists got mad because it would cut down on the profits of smuggling tea. In reaction to the tax put on tea, the anti-British group known as the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans and dumped tea overboard into the sea, wasting millions of dollars worth in today's money. Other colonists forced ships with tea on them to turn around without docking or unloading any of it. Many of the colonists thought that the lower price on tea was to make them accept the fact that the British could impose any taxes that they wanted. The overall impacts of the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party was the British government showing that they could and would tax any of the colonists' goods if they wanted to, because tea was such an important factor of the English and colonists' lives.
People have a cause that they believe in. People want something they do not have. They may not have freedom of speech. They may feel that they are being treated unfairly or that the ruling government is corrupt. The colonists rebelled for these reasons, as well as wanting representation.
The Stamp Act showed how the colonists were upset that England was using them to gain revenue. The Tea Act made the colonists angry because they felt England could tax anything they wanted. The Sugar Act made colonists pay more taxes for daily things. The British courts would be deciding outcomes for tax violations. The Quartering Act made colonists angry because they were being forced to house British soldiers.
The Currency Act had Britain controlling the printing and use of colonial paper money. These acts all have a part in the American Revolution, and they show how the colonists were upset and felt they were being treated unfairly. In 2015, the United States saw a rebellion when people felt they were being treated without respect and unjustly by police. The group Black Lives Matter reacted in rebellion in response to anti-black racism.
There were riots and protests, some of which were violent. When Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times by a Chicagoan police officer, many people got angry. Protesters marched on Michigan Avenue, shutting down the street and keeping people from shopping. The people decided to rebel to tell their story and try to get people on their side. This is the way that change happens.
It was because of the rebellion during the American Revolution that the Revolutionary War happened. If these things didn't happen, we couldn't still be a part of Britain. Hopefully the story that the Black Lives Matter group is telling today will lead to more just and fair treatment by the police.
This podcast was recorded by Sidney
Sunny Chen,
Amy Drakowski,
Lauren Meyer, and Kyra Seaben.